Say what you will about Wii Sports, but it felt magical back in 2006. It put you into the game like nothing else before had, literally thanks to the Miis, but it was really the Wii's motion controls that put it on the map, tapping into a VR-like zeitgeist years before that would become a reality. Now, even though it got a sequel with Wii Sports Resort, along with an underwhelming Wii U remake a few years later, the series has otherwise been dormant for the better part of a decade. Until now. Enter Nintendo Switch Sports, which is basically half remake and half sequel, featuring 6 sports in total split evenly between new and returning ones, along with an entirely revamped look. Sorry me, sports mates are the new hotness. But is it all enough to recapture that original sense of magic? Well, no, not quite. But it can still offer a really good time, at least once I had a few friends over. In classic Wii Sports fashion, it straddles the line between simplicity and intricacy almost perfectly, offering simple but convincing motion controls that make it feel like you're much more talented in these sports than you probably are. Yeah, I'm talking to you, Andre, Mr. Fan of yourself. The nerve of this guy! But there's still enough depth to each sport to make it engaging for far beyond just a few plays. For better or worse, the 3 returning sports are nearly unchanged, so you'll feel right at home if you played them before. And I'm happy to say that it's still a lot of fun mimicking the motion of swinging, bowling, and sword playing. It's just a very familiar type of fun if you played the previous games. Now, the Joy-Con's gyro sensors do allow for slightly more nuanced control than was possible in the first game, but pretty much in the same way that the sequel and Wii U remake already explored, such as how you can no longer wiggle your way to victory in tennis. Trust me, we tried. Although, I did find the tennis here to be a little easier to control compared to Wii Sports Club, which is to say, I wasn't great at that one. Bowling in particular still feels pretty much perfect. Although, you no longer have to release a button to actually throw the ball, which I do kind of miss. But that's an easy thing to forget about in light of one fantastic new feature, being that everyone can now bowl at the same time, even in local multiplayer, which is freaking amazing as it'll save you a ton of time, literally cutting it down to a fourth of how long it would take when playing with 4 players. I don't think I can ever go back to painstakingly taking turns now, though the option's still there if you want it. The only slight drawback is that you might be so focused on your own game that you completely miss where your opponents are up to. Though that might be a good thing to keep rolling strikes, Johnny! There's even an online mode that takes us to the extreme with what's basically a 16-player battle royale, called Survival Bowling, with the lowest scoring players being gradually kicked out. And I really enjoyed this mode based on the playtest a few months ago. But sadly, Nintendo didn't make the online available during the review period, and thus, we won't be accounting for it in our verdict. Furthermore, bowling now offers a special variant too that builds on a mode introduced in Wii Sports Club, which plops various hazards in your path that tested your ability to add just the right amount of spin. But this time, those hazards include elevation changes and gaps in the track. It's a fun way to mix up what might otherwise be a very familiar experience. That same overall familiar feeling also applies to swordplay too, or Chambara as it's now called. Was swordplay just a little too straightforward, Nintendo? In any case, this one's also mostly unchanged from its first appearance in Wii Sports Resort, where you swing a sword with nearly 1-to-1 accuracy in an attempt to knock your opponent off an elevated platform. It's a real bloodbath, or maybe just a bath in this case. But at least this time, it's much more obvious when an opponent is blocking, as that's extremely useful information as it can otherwise make or break your game, as you'll find yourself stunned if you attack from the wrong angle. This time though, you can choose from 3 different sword types. The classic sword, which behaves just like the original game, a charged sword, which lets you unleash a powerful attack after 2 successful blocks, or the ability to dual wield with the twin swords, which similarly lets you unleash a powerful spin attack once the meter fills up. These 2 extra swords add yet another option to your moveset and helps provide just a little bit more depth, especially because you and your opponent don't have to choose the same sword. Personally, I think I like the charged sword best, because even though dual wielding is fun, it's perhaps just a little bit too chaotic. But outside of a few small tweaks in this handful of additions, these 3 sports are pretty much the exact same sports that you might remember from before. And I can't help but be a little disappointed that Nintendo didn't go a bit farther with them. Like, say, I don't know, letting us finally control our players' movement in tennis? That could have added an extra layer to freshen the experience for the returning sports. Furthermore, multiple modes for the sports that returned in Wii Sports Resort are missing here, like 100-pin bowling or Chambara's Fruit Ninja mode, or the awesome Showdown feature, which was just a really fun single-player adventure. So just to be clear, the 3 returning sports are still a lot of fun, and I'm sure golf will be too once it's added later this year. It's just that they don't offer much that we haven't already seen before. Thankfully, that's where the 3 new sports come in, with one of them being a true standout and perhaps the best sport in Wii Sports history, with one major caveat. But first, let's talk about badminton, which is essentially a faster-paced tennis that relies on slightly more nuanced racket control. Unfortunately, it's relegated to one-on-one matches only, which is super weird because 2-on-2 badminton is totally a thing that exists in real life, and that's a bit of a drag when you have 3 or 4 people that want to play. In any case, it's pretty fun, but its inclusion feels a little redundant with how similar it is to tennis. Also, maybe it's just me, but I really wish I could bounce a birdie in my racket like the Sportsmate does here. Why can't I do this, Nintendo? Moving on, we have 2-on-2 volleyball, which is just complicated enough that it's one of the only sports where it requires an entire tutorial. As with the real thing, you and your teammate will have to work together to bump, set, and spike the ball every time it returns to your side, with each one of those actions having a unique gesture. It's fun and pretty faithful to the actual sport, but it can be a bit confusing at first since you're constantly swapping roles. Now this one almost has a bit of a rhythm game feel to it, with how consecutively well-timed hits results in a faster spike, which for a game being based on teamwork is especially satisfying. If your teammate sets you up well, you can really spike that ball. Furthermore, when on defense, the game lets you reposition yourself side to side for a better block, which adds a nice touch of strategy. All things considered, this is definitely one of the more complicated sports, but it grew on me the more I played it. Unfortunately, playing volleyball locally in multiplayer splits the screen for every player, rather than by team like in tennis. And with how small the screens can get with 3 or 4 players, it can be hard to see the ball or even tell what's going on. That, combined with the frame rate being halved at 30 frames per second, makes it a bit annoying to play with more than 2 players locally. Now let's move on to my personal star of the show. Rocket League, baby! Or soccer as the game calls it, but it really is more like Rocket League. Complete with an oversized ball that the camera locks onto, and the overall super arcadey gameplay featuring either 1-on-1 or 4-on-4 action. And this one is ridiculously fun, even if it barely resembles actual soccer, especially since you use your hand to kick in this case. Although an update coming this summer will let you use a leg strap to actually kick if you prefer. Now, unlike most of the other sports, you have full control over your player's movement, including sprinting, jumping, and kicking in any direction by swinging the Joy-Con. Swing it left or right for a side kick, up for a lob shot, or down for a ground one, with your exact movement influencing the angle. You can also perform a header by swinging both Joy-Cons downward at the same time, which can send the ball flying. Though as a consequence of this, you'll find yourself stuck on the ground for a moment, and possibly winded too, as it takes a massive chunk of your stamina. So it's a risk. In fact, stamina management is critical, because if you fall behind while out of breath, well, you might just hand the goal to your opponent. Especially since that meter only starts to refill if you refrain from sprinting for a couple of seconds. So you have to be extremely measured in how often you use it. And I have to say, I don't think I've played any single Wii sport ever for as long as I played soccer in a single sitting. Me and my friends kept coming back for one more match. Again, and again, and again. It's just that fun. The freedom and depth afforded by the controls are both simple to understand, while adding a higher skill ceiling than most of the other sports, making it a complete blast to try and master, like a more accessible version of Rocket League. I especially enjoy playing 1-on-1, which surprised me given that soccer is normally a team-based sport. But it's way too fun trying to outwit and outplay a single opponent. And not just because we get caught up in these epic back and forths. But for as awesome as soccer is, it also has 2 big problems. First, it only supports 2 players locally. Why? I mean, if volleyball can support 4 players locally via split screen, why can't soccer? There isn't even an option for 2 versus 2, which is completely bizarre, as I can only imagine playing with 2 teams of 2 would be a complete blast. And that also speaks to my second issue, the nearly complete lack of options, which affects every sport to a degree, but is most noticeable with soccer. Do you want to play more than a 3-minute round of soccer? Well, too bad, because 3 minutes is all you get. Or do you want to turn off the gold ball that sometimes appears in the words 2 points instead? Sorry, you're out of luck. The lack of options also shines a spotlight on the overall lack of content. New content especially. In any case, 4-on-4 soccer is fun too, and I do appreciate the added ability to easily pass the ball to a teammate or call for them to pass it to you with a tap of a button. Though again, with only 2 players supported locally, having to rely on CPUs to fill in for the other 6 players detracts from some of the fun. Of course, 8 players are supported online, though again, we weren't able to test this for the review. Soccer feels the most like a fully self-contained game, probably because it's the only sport that gives you full control of your character and the camera. And it's the one I'll definitely be returning the most to. Now, soccer also has a second mode called Shootout, where you aim to score as many goals as possible by making an actual kicking motion, thanks to the Ring Fit Adventure leg strap. Unfortunately, this mode is super lame, being based entirely on timing and having almost no depth. And it didn't help that it often misread my movements, where I would wind up to kick, but it would read that as a kick itself. If that's a sign of things to come with the leg strap accessory being supported in the main soccer game, well, I'll be sitting that one out. Now, as a pretty big fan of the Wii Remote in general, the Joy-Cons fill in that role well enough, although it can feel a little awkward when you end up being stuck with a left-handed one as a right-handed player and vice versa. Furthermore, while the lack of a sensor bar does make calibrating slightly less elegant in swordplay, the controls consistently felt responsive and rarely fell out of sync. But I will say that the Wii Remote's general size and form factor did do a better job at approximating the feel of a racket in the hand. And for as silly as it could be, I do kinda miss the Wii Remote speaker, as there's nothing quite like hearing the thwack of returning a ball in tennis come right from the controller. Now as for the HD Rumble, it's fine, but I was hoping for a slightly more satisfying amount of feedback. Speaking of HD related things, Nintendo Switch Sports has a pretty wonderful presentation, being bright, cheery, and full of detail. I really like how the game's setting at Spalco Square doubles as the main menu, which contextualizes the location of every sport within this world, to the point that you can even recognize landmarks while playing the sports themselves. Now, Wii Sports Resort basically did the same thing too, but this time there's sadly no option to fully explore the space, which would have been a fun touch. Especially since there's a ton of detail to be found around every field and court, including various shops, ads, and otherwise points of interest. I also love how the music is diegetic, as if it were being played by courtside speakers rather than being piped directly into your TV. You'll also find a ton of spectators everywhere, roaming around, chatting, sipping coffee, or eating ice cream. Just try not to look too closely at the ones farther away. Hey, I said don't look! And I have to say that after initially being disappointed by the Mii replacements being the Sportsmates, they've since grown on me and they vibe well with this world, even though they do lack the diversity that the Mii's had. And I also kinda miss being able to recognize family and friends in the background. But thankfully, you can still play as your Mii if you really want to. And they do look pretty sharp here. Although I do wonder what the Sportsmates must think of them.
Back! Back, please! Back! I warn ya!
Performance-wise, the game generally runs at a buttery smooth 60 frames per second, minus some odd slowdown in the menus. However, the game does drop to 30 frames per second for 3 and 4 player split screen, which happens in bowling and volleyball. And it's especially distracting in the latter's case, as I mentioned earlier. But no matter what sport you play, you're probably going to have a good time, as long as you play with friends, because Nintendo Switch Sports is aggressively mediocre as an offline single-player experience. There's no campaign or any kind of progression to speak of. There aren't even any unlockable customizations for your Sportmate, as they're all relegated to the online mode, which again we weren't able to test. All you can really do is take on the computer in one-off exhibition matches, which isn't especially fun or rewarding. Even the achievement stamp system from Wii Sports Resort and Club is missing here. So it's clear that Nintendo intended this to be a multiplayer experience first and foremost, whether it be local or online. Which is fine as long as you know that going in. The thing is, while Wii Sports was a trailblazer for motion controls in the pre-VR world and was incredibly novel for it, Nintendo Switch Sports comes at a time when virtual reality is not only relatively commonplace now, but offers takes on most of those same sports that blow them away in terms of accuracy and finesse. And in that sense, Nintendo Switch Sports just can't deliver that same magical feeling that Wii Sports and Wii Sports Resort did all those years ago. But the technology still works more than well enough for the purposes that Switch Sports was aiming for. And there is just something about playing together in a room full of friends that even VR can't compete with. Especially when the those sports is bloody fantastic. Yeah, soccer, I'm looking at you. So overall, Nintendo Switch Sports is a bit uneven, sometimes feeling like it's doing the bare minimum to qualify as a sequel rather than a remake. The overall lack of new experiences is disappointing, especially when only one of them supports more than 2 players locally. And even then, the total amount of sports is barely more than the original game, and only half of that in the dozen found in Wii Sports Resort, or arguably even less when you account for all the missing side modes. All that being said, there is still a lot of fun to be had here, at least again when you're playing with friends. And that soccer mode is so freaking good that nearly justifies the game all by itself. So overall, I like Nintendo Switch Sports, at least as an offline multiplayer experience. It's still a lot of fun, even when it feels overly familiar. I just wish we'd been able to test it as an online experience too. But we'll make sure to follow up with additional coverage as soon as we can once it becomes available. And with that, thank you so much for watching our review of Nintendo Switch Sports. And of course, stay tuned to GameSplay for more Nintendo Switch Sports, and everything else Nintendo Switch that isn't sports too.
What about Battle League?
With that, we'll catch you later. Bye everyone!